Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the presentation of the results for the first half of 2023. Welcome to 2G Energy. We recently reported order intake and net sales, now the whole package. So, first of all, here's the general overview of the key figures. The net sales grew, as earlier reported, by an impressive 21.5 million euros, which corresponds to 18.9%. This enormous acceleration comes from all core regions and all segments. The output also leaves nothing to be desired. It increases even more than net sales, namely by a whopping 20.7% to now 166.3 million euros. The factory is running, processes interlock neatly, the material supply is physically back on track. All this can be seen in the EBIT. It amounts to 4.1 million euros and thus increases clearly disproportionately by 1.5 million euros. And the liquidity, it goes down, but this is completely within normal fluctuations. As you know, we have two different perspectives on our net sales development. Here, as always, first a breakdown of sales into the new machines business, the so-called CHP plants, here in dark green, and into service and spare parts, here in light green. In addition, I've again shown you the net sales of the second half of the year in gray. As I said, the total net sales grew by 19%. Particularly pleasing is the machinery business, which grew by 27%. The strongest growth was in Germany, plus 8.3%, and especially in the rest of Europe, plus 54.5%. This growth in sales was already predictable at the end of 2022, because by then it was clear that the many CHP units that were technically ready and could be connected to the grid would also be reflected in the income statement as a sales boost in the course of the first half of the year. Service is obviously also continuing its strong growth by 14%. This is particularly pleasing as we are no longer dealing with any rest service operations that come up because COVID had at some point prevented us from properly maintaining and repairing CHPs. Not at all, particularly abroad, and here especially in the countries where we have been active for a long time, the service business is growing. On the one hand, because more and more machines are now entering the maintenance-intensive second phase of their lives, which significantly increases the turnover per machine. On the other hand, in many markets, it is the case that parallel to the growth in the number of units of these medium-aged CHPs, we are also building up more of our own service staff in the respective market. Metaphorically speaking, the service pie is growing because the population of medium-aged machines is growing. But we are taking a proportionally larger slice of the growing cake because we are doing more direct business and no longer rely solely on partners in these more important markets. But please do not misunderstand, this is not a rejection of the partner concept. In fact, the piece of the pie for our partners is also growing, just not quite as fast as it grows for us. The second perspective is, as always, the export ratio, which you can see here. Due to the growth in service just explained, the German market is gaining in importance in absolute and relative terms. The export ratio is finally rising again, namely to 38%. But please, as you know and as you can see from the gray box above, by far the largest part of the sales is still ahead of us. Whether the export ratio should really rise in this year or not is hard to say today. In any case, Germany continues its solid growth course with 8% to now 83.8 billion euros. Significantly powerful are the countries abroad with a plus of 41% to now almost 52 million euros. As I said, the established markets in particular grew significantly in absolute terms. So let's turn to the income statement. We have already talked about the sales revenues. Again, really remarkable, the change in inventory, which, as you already know, consists mainly of technically almost completed finished CHPs. As you can see, this value has increased by another 7 million euros to almost 31 million euros. This is remarkable because this time there was no sales bottleneck, so we delivered and sold properly. At the same time, however, production was not only eager to deliver, it increased the stocks of technically almost completed finished CHPs by a good 30 million euros. Thus, it processed firm orders for CHPs. In many cases, these firm customer orders now only need to be connected to the grid and then be finally invoiced. So we are looking to the current second half of the year with a certain degree of optimism. Very high sales in combination with production expansion lead to a total output at a record level, namely 166.3 billion euros, an output increase of almost 21%. Of course, this is reflected in the cost of material, which initially also increased by 21%. This means that the cost of material ratio has stagnated or risen slightly from 67.3% to 67.6%. This shows, on the one hand, machine sales played a greater role again in the first half of the year, and machines have a higher material share than services. On the other hand, it also shows that the material price increases have lost momentum and, much more important, with our own price increases, we are now coming back into a range that, relative to the material input, fits again. This means that our own list price increases no longer lag behind developments in the procurement market. Instead, our list prices now match the input prices again, so that the material cost ratio at least no longer increases. On the other hand, the personnel expenses increase by 14%. That is almost 4 million euros, but this is clearly disproportionately low in relation to the increase of output. In other words, the personnel expenses ratio decreases by 1.2 percentage points. Well, the significant growth in total output has not been followed by a corresponding wave of recruitment, because then the personnel ratio would not have fallen. We see the expansion of output took place relatively quietly because the Lead to Lean project is now taking hold across the board. By the way, this becomes visible in an effect that is, I would say, curious to external observers. In the past 6 months, we have converted the entire assembly line to single shift operations, although our order books are full and although we have increased output by 21%. This is only possible because we are now more process-oriented internally and thus have a much greater division of labor. We can combine 2 shifts into 1 shift without people standing on their feet. And you know that yourself. People are more productive at 9:30 in the morning than at 9:30 in the evening. And that is noticeable. Unfortunately, you can only see this effect with 1.2 percentage points in the personnel expense ratio. But please do not forget, we have to cope with a wage increase of 6% compared to the previous years. Against this background, the significant reduction in the personnel expense ratio is very, very satisfying. Depreciation hardly changes. Other operating expenses increased by 2.5 million euros in absolute terms. As in recent years, they remain at 10% of total output. The increase can be explained by normalized travel expenses because in the first 6 months of 2023 it was possible to travel again without any restrictions, unlike in the corresponding period of 2022. In addition, some additional IT costs which could not be capitalized in connection with the current ERP project. And finally, we also had to deal with higher energy expenses. But as I said, in relative terms, other operating expenses have remained stable at exactly 10% of total output. Other taxes are unchanged. so that we end up with an EBIT that is a whopping 62% above the previous year. We thus achieve an EBIT margin of 3% after 2.2% in the previous year. In absolute terms, this 4.1 million euro of EBIT represents clearly the best first half year ever. A good start into the second half of the year. Because, as you know, for us, a major part of the figures arise from the second half of the year. And as already noted several times in the increased number of corporate news in recent weeks, we confirm the forecast for the current year, namely net sales of 310 to 350 million euros, combined with an EBIT margin of 6.5 to 8.5%. In this respect, the first half of the year is a good starting point, but clearly there's still a lot to come in the second half. So let's turn to the operating working capital. This has, in the course of the first half of the year, declined slightly. And as a quick look over the deviations reveals, there is a whole range of value with partly significant changes. So, raw materials and supplies increase by a moderate 62 million euros. This means that the increase of 9% is clearly below the increase in total output, which was 21%. Logically, this means that we have shortened the inventory range. But the truth is also, besides further successes in the Lead to Lean project, normalization on the procurement side helps above all, of course. Reserves out of fear, as I call them, are simply no longer necessary. Unfinished products, to a very large extent delivered in practically finished CHPs, are also rising sharply. Specifically, we are stockpiling 30.6 million euros more in CHPs. These are ready for final settlements as soon as the customers confirms the transfer of risk. On the other hand, we have made advance payments for this material stock. We see these here, namely 9.9 million euros. And again, we also received 50.4 million euros in advance payments from customers for specific projects and procurement plans. We traditionally deduct these down payments with a specific project reference from the inventories. However, despite these concrete advance payments, inventories have increased quite significantly by 21% to 124.5 million euros, which is perfectly in line with the expansion of output. However, this increase in inventories are to a certain extent compensated by the receivables, which are now decreasing significantly to 43.4 million euros. The background to this is that last December we experienced another real boost in sales. As a consequence, we had significantly increased receivables on our books at the end of the year. And these receivables have now been collected in the course of the first 6 months. Advance payments received without specific order references increases in parallel to advance payments with a specific order reference, namely also by a significant 13.3 million euros, an increase of 30%. Trade payables increased by 4 million euros. That is 90% more than at the end of the year, so it fits in with the increase in total output. All in all, the operating working capital decreases slightly by 1.2 million euros. This leads me to the next page, the development of liquidity. Here we see that the cash and cash equivalents decreased, despite the slightly positive effect from the net working capital by 1 million euros. So let's take a closer look at this development. EBIT contributes 4.1 million euros to liquidity. Depreciation 2.4 million euros. And then the minor change in the net working capital, Conversions and changes in other liabilities are to be interpreted purely technically or as of the reporting date. No particular additional risk, but still an increase of 6.5 million euros in total. Most of this is accounted for obligations from the payments of social security and value-added tax. Then there are the income tax payments, which remain unchanged at 1.2 million euros in the first half of the year. The whole figures accumulate in an operating cash flow that is practically zero in the first half year of 2023. At the investment side, there was not much to report in the first half of the year, just the usual. That means vehicles, in most cases service vans, hardware and software, and perhaps remarkable 0.4 million euros for the construction work on the new multipurpose hall here in Hague. The purchase of Energietech, which I will talk about again at the end of the presentation, was completed on the 24th of August, so in Q3 of 2023. The cash outflow from financing activities and dividend payment was characterized by the dividend, which was increased again, namely 2.5 million euros instead of 2.3 million euros in the previous year and 1.9 million euros before that. And then there was a repayment of 1.4 million euros. Ultimately, we have cash and cash equivalent of 5.9 million at the end of Q2. However, we took out short-term money market loans of 5.5 million euros at the end of June, which must be deducted from the cash. This explains the difference to the cash balance. Ladies and gentlemen, these were my comments on the figures for the first half year of 2023. A half year without a pandemic and without further military actions in Europe, but also a half year that was characterized for long times by uncertainties in the energy sector. First, the fears of a gas shortage, followed by the German Building Energy Act, which really could not contribute to calming the domestic market and which is still causing uncertainty because it has still not been passed. If we now ask ourselves, what will the second half look like, then we will probably have to live, at least on the domestic market, with the uncertainty that continues to emanate from the lively and for a long time confusing discussion on energy policy. But let me say again, we keep our forecast, which we have recently confirmed several times, with sales of 310 to 350 million euros. If you divide this net sales purely arithmetically in line with previous years into 45% service and 55% CHP turnover, we get this picture. And if you compare this machine turnover with the order backlog at the beginning of the second half of the year, you can see that there will probably be no lack of orders. With an order backlog of 194 million euros, we can realize 181.5 million euros in net sales. That would be an increase in sales in the machinery sector of almost exactly 10%. But please do not forget, when it comes to the final invoice, we are always in the customer's hands. The customer must confirm the transfer of risk. If he doesn't do this in December, but for what reason, in January, the sales slips from 223 to 224. So there remains some uncertainty, which we are trying to minimize by standardizing customer contracts more, especially with regard to the transfer of risk, and by planning the sales process more long-term and monitoring it more closely. Both of these measures, that means contract standardization and closer monitoring, are now working quite well for us, especially in Germany. On the other hand, with a growing foreign business, also outside the G7 countries, we are getting additional unpredictable cases in the year-end ready. However, we are currently assuming that CHP sales will grow at a respectable rate also for 2023 as a whole. It is certainly much more difficult to forecast the effect of price increases on the input side by our suppliers, and on our side in the form of list prices increases or through additional discounts. We therefore stick to our EBIT forecast of 6.5 to 8.5%, which should lead to an average EBIT of just under 25 million euros for a 330 million euro top line. Finally, let me tell you a few facts about our new subsidiary Energietech BV. First of all, who is Energietech? Energietech is a small but fine company located in the middle of the Netherlands, about 180 kilometers away from Heek. It was founded in 2010 by Jochem van Haren and Martin van Meurs, and both founders have been active in the company so far and will continue to be in the years to come. With a very small team supported by subcontractors when the order situation was right, the two founders realized about 1.5 to 3 million euros in annual sales. And they do so with heat pumps that start in the lower capacity range, but also with large capacity heat pumps, which are so attractive for us. Energietech already has a good 200 references for large capacity heat pumps, which will of course be a significant accelerator for us in terms of market penetration. Up to now, Energietech has only served the Benelux countries with a focus on the Netherlands. We want to change that. In the future, the team in Rosmalen will continue to focus on research and development and will also continue to do sales in Benelux. Sales in the other regions, especially in Germany, the UK and France, but basically everything outside Benelux, will be handled by 2G and our partners. We will concentrate on large capacity heat pumps. This does not automatically mean that Energietech in Benelux will now drop all smaller projects and products, but outside the Benelux, certainly only large capacity heat pumps will be sold. Of course, for such projects, the invoicing process is similar to CHP's. This means that invoicing can only take place once the risk has been transferred. And that also means in the coming year, we should not expect any significant contribution to the net sales and the results, except for the current sales in Benelux, because business in Benelux continues seamlessly. But we are already expecting incoming orders amounting to a mid-single-digit million range for 2024. And in the long run, I mean really very long run, we see the heat pump in sales and earning power equally important to us as CHPs. I should mention that the margins on a heat pump are somewhat higher than those on CHPs. On the other hand, the service business is not as attractive, which is not surprising, as the combustion engine of a CHP is more maintenance intensive than a heat pump. So here's a brief look at the competitive situation. There are already a number of suppliers, all with large capacity heat pumps in their product range. But it is not enough to have a large capacity heat pump in the price list. You also have to be able to develop and manage projects. In addition, the power plants must be reliably monitored and serviced. And with these core elements of a problem solution, which means project development and design, reliable commissioning, system integration and control, and finally, reliable monitoring and service, this is exactly where we see our advantages. We come from the project business and not from the catalog goods. Project development and management, commissioning, integration of complex requirements, service, control, and so on, and so on. That is what we have always been good at. Here's one of the about 200 references from Energietech, the reconstruction and extension of a large office complex with space for up to 1,550 employees. There included is a heat pump with 700 kilowatt thermal output, which is fed with 150 to 200 kilowatt of electricity, with all the advantages and disadvantages that this setup includes if the electricity is not coming from clean sources. We always say heat pump, that fits. So here we want to show a reference from a very large project that is described quite prominently on the internet and especially on YouTube. A power and heating plant that the Gloat company in Papenburg, North Germany, recently built and now operates, not for the large shipyard, but to supply the local greenhouse operators with electricity and above all with heat. The picture here is taken directly from the Gloat homepage. We supplied the CHP for this power plant for electricity and heat. We did not supply the head control of the CHP and heat pump, but because of the detail and the publicly accessible project description, it is worth taking a closer look on this special project. You can see very nicely on the left-hand side what goes in: natural gas, hydrogen, environmental heat, and also electricity peaks when its price is attractive. Then you can see how the input factors are processed. CHP, of course, hydrogen ready, high performance heat pump, power to heat with a fairly simple immersion heater, and then the clearly visible heat storage. To the right you can see what is supplied, namely thermal energy up to 15 megawatt and electricity up to 9 megawatt. So as you can see, we certainly also know complex solutions, but very important, we are and remain a series manufacturer, even if it is a small series. Even if it looks like plant engineering, the components configured here, especially the CHP and the heat pump, are more or less standard devices. And with the new ERP system, which we are currently introducing, we will also further standardize project management. Away from project folders, partly digital, partly on paper, away from overviews in A3 format, away from individual project processes and schedules, towards a fully integrated project control system that plans all resources, manages all documents, plans and monitors deadlines, contains workflows, and organizes communication between the project's participants. And we already have all this, or it is in the process of being created, and we will put it into operations within the next 18 months. As you can see, we are well prepared for the new era. As the last point of this presentation, I want to give you a very brief illustration of the process steps in a project, whether CHP or heat pump. R&D and product design. With the exception of the engine of the CHP and the compressor of the heat pump, they have large overlaps. Supplier selection, very large overlap. Sales and project acquisition, very large overlaps. Project planning, I've already mentioned, practically identical. Sourcing, very large overlaps. Assembly, quality control, commissioning, system integration, and digital control and monitoring, virtually identical. Service, very large overlaps, even if the work on the unit itself is of course different. But the whole organization, training, staff recruitment, logistics, development, planning, etc. is virtually identical. So you see, there are large synergies between CHPs and heat pumps. Let's look forward to the time ahead, because we believe, or better, we know, the heat pump is a sensible extension of our product portfolio, not just a simple addition. The synergies are immense, and I haven't even mentioned the interaction between CHP and heat pump yet, depending on concrete weather situation and or price situations for electricity. But I think that's enough for today. Thanks for your attention and your patience. I'm already looking forward to the next presentation to keep you informed. Take care.